And here you notice we first get out of the way using a horse stance, or at least stepping out the right foot very rapidly, right? Which leaves you open, right? So yes, the cat stance is going to be using this technique to line up your kick again, similarly like it was being used in technique number 1 and technique number 3, but there is an additional aspect here that we sometimes don't think about, and that is that when you step your right foot out, you are vulnerable. Your groin is exposed there for a moment. So pulling your left leg over into a cat stance takes care of that problem, right? Not only does that line up the kick, it covers you. It's a very fast way to assume a new stance, even though you're in a completely different location. You just, moved out of the way rapidly, yet you're in a stance almost instantly. Right? And we can go to the third form in the Kenpo system, short form 2, where we can see almost the same thing happening here. Right? Here it's actually your right arm and your left leg working in tandem, but you have an opponent coming from almost like approaching you while you are basically facing your opponent in a horse stance, and you have to cover quick, and the cat stance does that for you right here. But now there's another application right here in the same form, just before what we just spoke about, and that's as a rear cover, right? Very rapid directional change, 180 degrees, you're facing the opposite direction, and you are retreating in place since your cat stance shifts you back, right? And also this gives you the advantage of putting the rotational force of your upper body right back into this motion as well, so you can take advantage of using your rear arm, in this case, to block with. So you're taking advantage of the rotational force of this stance change. And now if we look at our self-defense techniques, we can see how they take advantage of that exact same motion with even more practicality, I guess you could say, right? If you look at blue belt right here, the technique against the two-hand push, you can see how your right arm pulls your opponent's right arm back, right? It's taking advantage of the fact that your upper body is moving back and your right shoulder is moving back the most, and you're using that in order to pull the person into your kick. Right? And if you look at this, the front arm is basically taking advantage of this the same way as we were using it when we turned from a neutral bow to a forward bow stance, meaning that your front arm is able to use a reverse motion of your stance change. That's why it's pulling the opponent's arm rather than striking. And then here on brown belt we have the next example. This is a technique that is against a left-right punch combination. Right? And here it's now the rear arm that takes advantage of the stance change, which is again similar to the stance changes that we had from a neutral bow to the forward bow stance. But now it's a forward moving motion because it's the rear arm that can take advantage of this. Right? But notice it's doing a block rather than a strike, and that is largely due to the fact that the cat stance doesn't give you that forward motion. Had we turned into a forward bow stance and used our rear arm to strike forward with, we can get a lot of forward momentum there in addition to the rotational force. But when you move back to the cat stance, you lose a lot of that. So that makes the rear arm ideal for blocking, not so ideal for striking. Okay? Your opponent has to be much closer for a strike to be effective with the rear arm in a cat stance. Right? Now I mentioned earlier that the cat stance has less depth than the neutral bow stance, right? And that also means that you're giving up your bracing angle, particularly because you have 90% of your weight on your back leg. So you can get pushed over more easily. Right? But there's at least one situation where that really is not going to be a problem, and it's an environmental situation. Your back is against a wall. Well, you're not going to get pushed over now. And the disadvantage of losing the bracing angle is not really much of a disadvantage anymore. And the advantage of having that extra ability to retreat away from your opponent, since you can't shuffle back, you're up against the wall, that is very useful. So your cat stance can come in handy in this situation. You see, it can be worth doing this because you have that front kick that is now almost continuously available, right? And so here then you have the opportunity to actually throw repeated kicks with your front leg, right? Because you never have to put your foot all the way back down to the ground as long as you're in a cat stance. Just be careful that you don't do this if you're being grabbed, since obviously you could get pulled down to the ground, right? So the cat stance is not good in situations where somebody might grab you, right? Now, I've mentioned several times that the cat stance usually moves back, right? When you come from a neutral bow stance and you turn from there into a cat stance, well, you're moving back with your body. And that means that you don't have much depth of penetration with your hand strikes to the front. You also don't have any momentum going to the front. You do have great momentum though going to the back. So you could execute strikes moving to the back, and now you're gaining momentum and you're gaining depth of penetration. So for example, a back hammer fist could be very useful right here. Also, the reversing strikes, like a hook to the front, could take advantage of your body moving back, since it's a reversing strike. But when it comes to a strike moving forward, usually a cat stance is not suited for that all that well, for the reasons we just mentioned, right? But there are exceptions to that. And let's look at a couple of self-defense techniques that do move the cat stance forward and that use forward momentum, where you do use your hand strikes and you're gaining not only forward momentum, but you're also gaining depth of penetration. Okay? So the first technique that we can look at that gives us an example for this is on purple belt. Here's the self-defense techniques against a two-hand wrist grab. Okay? And this is the third move we're talking about here. Okay? On the second move, you had your vertical punch to the solar plexus, right? And you're in a left forward bow stance. And you're now going to move your back foot forward into what Mr. Parker refers to as a close cat stance. Okay? So it's a right cat stance, but your foot doesn't have to be extended quite as far as you usually have it, because this is a transitory position right here that is really serving one purpose. It is breaking apart the step-through maneuver from a left forward bow all the way to a right neutral bow with a palm strike. It's breaking that maneuver apart into two sections, so we can insert one more strike in between. And this strike is timed with the cat stance. This is the left outward hand sword, thrusting hand sword, to our opponent's throat, right, with the left hand as you basically in a right cat stance. But this cat stance was moving in a linear fashion. It was not rotating at all. Right? It was moving straight forward. So here's a good example of how you can have forward momentum with a cat stance, giving you full depth of penetration. Right? And then there's another technique we can look at, and now this one is going to be on green belt, and it's a self-defense technique against the right roundhouse kick. And here, even though we're going to angle off, we're going to switch angles in the middle of this technique, that doesn't make this circular though. It's still a linear move. If you look at it, essentially what we're doing is we're going to shuffle our back foot up towards the front foot and assume the cat stance that way. Now we're turning in place as we're doing that, but it doesn't change the fact that your back foot moves up and now gives you forward momentum in the direction of your opponent, and in this case, as you're punching with your front arm, you can rotate a little bit as well. So it's possible to rotate the right shoulder forward there. But note also that this cat stance then provides you power for that right punch, forward momentum, and, if desired, rotational force. But also the same stance maneuver, the same moving up of the back foot, can help you kick. And now you do have some choices here. You could actually use forward momentum that is generated, the forward momentum that is generated by the back foot moving up. You could use that just for the punch and then settle into a cat stance and do the kick from there. Or you can also simply continue that whole motion and do an immediate succession from the punch to the kick, so that the kick itself still takes advantage of that forward momentum as well. Essentially what you get is a shuffle kick. Obviously there's going to be more momentum there, right? And more power there. But the point here is it's a linear move. You're not rotating, or you can rotate, but you don't have to. Right? But you're definitely gaining forward momentum. And you're gaining depth of penetration. It's linear, and it's moving forward. So next, let's talk about the wide kneel stance and the close kneel stance. Those are very important. We use them quite a bit. You could really kind of say that both of those stances are lowercase versions of the neutral bow stance and the forward bow stance. Right? There are times when you want to be lower. Right? I'm going to explain that in just a moment. These two stances give us that opportunity. The wide kneel stance is essentially a neutral bow stance that you drop down lower. Okay? Nothing turns, basically you're just in place and you just drop down. Of course the back knee is going to be dropping or bending more, so you're going to have to pick your back heel up off the ground in order to accomplish that. Right? The close kneel stance, you could say, is just a forward bow stance that has been dropped lower. Right? Here we drop it lower substantially because we're going to bring that back knee down to about 1 to 2 inches off the ground. Right? And by the way, both of these stances still have a 50-50 weight distribution. Right? But you can see here how these are just very low examples of two stances we already had. Okay? So now why do we want to have that? Why would we want to do that? Right? Why do we need stances that are lower like this? Well, there are several reasons and several benefits of why we need and why we can benefit from the wide kneel stance as well as the closed kneel stance. Okay? And by the way, we're going to continue to talk about these two stances as a pair, simply because sometimes you will have to switch from one to the other based on the situation at hand. So even if a technique usually is taught with a closed kneel, you may have to switch to a wide kneel and vice versa. And again, we're going to explain that in a moment. Okay? Alright, so now, why do we even want to do that? Why do we even want to drop? Well, there's several benefits. Number one, sometimes you can drop under a punch. You can duck under a punch. All right, we have a few examples of that in our system, and we're going to show you some as we go on. Right? Sometimes it could simply be that you want to reach something that is lower. In other words, you want to have more depth of penetration to your target, and the target is low. Right? So you want to be able to drop down lower, not just in order to be able to reach that target, but also if you're dropping as you're striking downward, obviously that would give you the ability to use your body weight, right? So we're going to have really great examples of marriage of gravity here. Now, oftentimes when this does happen, when you come from a neutral bow or a forward bow and you drop down to wide kneels or closed kneel stances, right, you will often also have the opportunity to add rotation to that drop. We're going to demonstrate that more as we go on as well, but sometimes there can be still rotation of the upper body in here as well. So now you can couple the gravitational marriage together with the rotational force and have a considerably more powerful strike as a result. All right? The next thing that really becomes a benefit to using either the closed kneel or the wide kneel stance is really the fact that your rear knee is becoming a very formidable weapon. You're going to use your rear knee to check with, you can use it to buckle with. Okay? And again, we're going to explain that more in detail. Okay? And then also we got to remember the fact that the wide kneel and the closed kneel stance both allow you to maintain your posture or regain your posture when it's being compromised. Kenpo uses erect posture. We don't fight with our back bent over. And one of the reasons why we don't do that is because we don't want to turn this into a wrestling match, right? And it's easy to be pulled over if your back is bent, right? Secondly, that's not a good position to be in against multiple attackers. And Kenpo is designed to work very, very well in multiple attacker situations. So we have erect posture, always. Right? So what do you do if somebody puts you in a headlock? You know, that's not erect posture, right? So you got to get it back, or you got to, try. If you're fast enough, you might be able to prevent your opponent from getting you bent over in the first place, even though he's wrapping his arm around you, right? But your goal in the techniques that we have, right on yellow belt and orange belt level already, we have several techniques against headlocks, right? Side headlocks as well as front headlocks, right? The goal is to not go down to the ground, and that means you have to maintain your posture. In order to maintain your posture, since you cannot just bring your head up, since you're being held in place with somebody's body weight, right? You can't just bring your head up, so you have to bring your lower body down. In other words, you can't put your head over your hips. Well, now you got to put your hips under your head, right? So you need a stance that allows you to do that, and that is exactly what these two stances do. Okay? And you're going to note, by the way, that even though when you do these two stances and you compare them, the closed kneel is the lower of the two stances. The wide kneel is somewhat higher than the closed kneel. Nevertheless, the wide kneel stance has the potential of being lower still. In other words, because the knee is angled off to the side, you could actually have a wide kneel stance that is adjusted down to be even lower than a closed kneel stance is. Okay, that would be rare, but it does have that potential. But these headlock techniques are perfect examples for why you need these stances, because just like I mentioned already, you cannot afford to allow somebody to pull you down to the ground, right? So you need to be able to maintain your posture, but you have to remember that your opponent isn't just going to be statically staying there and allowing you to just stay in your stance. If the opponent is trying to put you in a headlock, they're probably going to pull you off balance. They're probably going to pull you sideways or forward or something, right? Because a good wrestler would do that. They would try to get you down to the ground. It's not just an attempt to hold you there. It is an attempt to drop you down to the ground. And if he just drops his body weight down, you're going to go with him. unless you know how to maintain and hold his body weight, right? So that's where the stance comes in handy. But if you look right here, look how important it is that you have footwork with the stance. Right? So a lot of students in Kenpo make the mistake of practicing this technique all statically, but you can't do that. It's the first thing that's going to happen is that your opponent is going to move away from you a little bit, and you need to go along with that and shuffle along with that and make sure that your opponent is not able to have you compromise your posture. And obviously this shows how important these stances are. If we did not have the wide knee and the closed knee stance, we wouldn't even be able to deal with the situation. Not without bending our back, right? So let's take a look at what these two stances have.